Welcome to episode 2 of Turn the Page, but the first one with the title, since books we wish we read isn't exactly a title. So last week in the first episode, we looked at The Chief, which is basically the biography of William Randolph Hearst, the OG of media. Today, we're going to take a look at the publisher, Henry Luce and his American Century. Henry Luce was the founder of Time magazine. Everyone and anyone that wants to build a media company always talks about building the next Viacom, meaning a company that owns amazing brands like MTV, Comedy Central, Nickelodeon, and much more. But before Viacom, there was Time Inc., the company that owned Time, Life, Sports Illustrated, and Fortune, and founded by none other than Henry Luce. So basically, Alan Brinkley wrote The Publisher. The Publisher is a fascinating look at the genius behind the founder of Time magazine. So Henry Luce was actually born in China. His parents were missionaries, and he basically went to Yale University where he met a certain gentleman named Brighton Haddon. Now, Haddon and Luce had very, very different personalities. They liked different things. They had different temperaments, but somehow, maybe through the love of storytelling and a desire to launch a magazine, they united, joined forces, and launched Time. Number one, Henry Luce was not just the founder, he was also the publisher of Time. While Haddon was essentially the editorial lead early on, Luce was the business genius behind Time. And that's partly why the name of the book is The Publisher and not The Chief as an editor-in-chief. To quote Bill Keller from the New York Times, the book does a fantastic job of not just describing the genius that was Luce, but also his insecurities as well as his obsession with men who held political power. Now, what doesn't make Luce an upstanding citizen is despite Haddon's contribution to Time, within 3 weeks of his death, he removed him off the masthead. Within a year, he took over his shares, and in the ensuing few years, of the hundreds of times that Luce would speak in public, Haddon's name was only mentioned less than 5 times. 2. An ambitious start. Luce and Haddon decided to raise $100,000 from Yale's alumni and elite. But in reality, they only raised $86,000, but that wasn't enough to stop them. Now, the interesting thing about Time, which was a weekly magazine, is they would basically take the daily newspaper New York Times, find the best stories, condense them, and publish their weekly. Basically, one of the earliest forms of, you guessed it, fair use. At its peak, Time magazine had the largest circulation in the world, reaching 26 million consumers, 20 million in the US alone. Of course, by the end of the century, Time was reaching a mere rounding error of that, 2 to 3 million. 3. A springboard into other verticals. The Publisher does a fantastic job not just of going back to the origins of Time, but breaking out how Luce and his team identified opportunities in other verticals. There was, of course, Fortune, the magazine dedicated to business. There was Sports Illustrated, covering all things sports, as well as the swimsuit issue. There was, of course, Life, one of the most successful magazine launches of all time, which was a magazine covering society, culture, and politics. And of course, People, which to this day is arguably the most successful magazine, period. And with that portfolio of successful magazine brands, Luce oversaw an empire that held all of the crown jewels in the landscape. 4. Political ambitions. So not that dissimilar to William Randolph Hearst, Henry Luce also had some political ambitions. Whereas William Randolph Hearst was a Democrat and emerged as a Republican over the course of his life, Henry Luce was a Republican throughout. He had a front row seat to not just the Great Depression, World War II, but the rise of American power throughout the Korean War. He also, through his pen, told the story. He was anti-Soviet. He tried to get the US, through John Kennedy's presidency, to attack even Cuba, and ultimately tried to nudge his influence throughout the day-to-day matters of the country, to no avail. 5. Henry Luce's death, legacy, and crumbling empire. When Henry Luce died, he left an estate worth over $100 million, but within decades, his empire fell apart. In 1989, Time merged with Warner Communications, creating one of the first conglomerates out there. By 2000, recognizing it needed a stronger hand online, Time Warner merged with AOL, which at first seemed kind of smart, but turned out to be one of the most disastrous mergers of all time, destroying $100 billion of market value. Now, by 2009, Time Warner had the upper hand, spun out AOL. And by 2014, it decided that those magazine brands didn't have that much value to the mothership. So it decided to spin off Time Inc. then. From 2014 to 2018, Time did a pretty admirable job trying to reinvent those brands in a digital age, to no avail. 2018, Meredith Corporation acquired Time, and to reduce some of the debt that it had incurred in buying Time Inc., decided to sell Time, Fortune, and eventually Sports Illustrated, keeping People, which was and remains one of the most successful magazines of all time. So if you're wondering, is this a book that I should read? Absolutely. If you want to get a good sense of how the telecommunications landscape has emerged, morphed, and continues to shift, then The Publisher is probably one of the first books that you should crack open when you decide to venture in business and media. Hope you enjoyed this second episode of Turn the Page. If you read this book, tell us what you think. And if there are other books you wish we would read, comment, and discuss, let us know in the comments.